The Russian forces continued offensive operations, gaining control over all of Novopavlivka on the eastern bank of the river line, except for a small portion at the northern outskirts of the town. What we see here is that the Russians managed to make a significant advance within the town and now solidify their gains and consolidate their positions following the initial push through the fog. It was then reported by Deep State Map that the movement through the fog was no small movement. Instead, approximately 10 vehicles, including armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, managed to make its way into the town before it was detected, and only 2 of those were destroyed. That means the other 8 were still roaming around the town at the time of the report. On top of that, there was a second wave through the fog, where they don't even know how many vehicles managed to get through. This allowed the Russians to quickly gain full control over the eastern bank of the town of Novopavlivka, leaving just the northern portion remaining under Ukrainian control. This geolocated footage here confirms the Russian presence on the northern outskirts of the town, leaving just a small portion right next to it remaining under Ukrainian control, which is up against the Solona River. The capture of the eastern bank of Novopavlivka will allow the Russians to slowly push through to gain control over the portions to the southeast and reach up towards the fortifications near Myrnohrad to connect the towns of Myrnohrad and Novopavlivka, and push up to regain control over Novopavlivka, which will allow them to gain full control over the border between the Donetsk and the Pokrovsk region from the west of Pokrovsk all the way down to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. So what we see is that the Russians are slowly consolidating their positions along the border area and the Solona River, following which the Russians are already launching offensive operations towards Novopavlivka, where the Russian objective will be to combine the forces along the TO406 highway in the direction of Myrnohrad and from Novopavlivka in the south up towards Myrnohrad, where the Russians will significantly improve their logistics with the connection of the highway from Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad, Novopavlivka and Kudahove, all connected to the city of Donetsk itself. This allowed the Russians to start offensive operations beyond the defensive line on the border between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region towards Slovianka in the north, and in the western direction towards the next defensive line, which is the final defensive line established before the rear of the Dnipropetrovsk region. And these are defensive lines that are not as well prepared as the ones at the border, and the ones being built right now and in the future will not be as strong as this defensive line. And we can see the further the Russians progress, the weaker the defenses of the Ukrainians become, and the more casualties the Ukrainians will be taking for defending the same type of defense, because the fortifications are simply not prepared well enough. To the southwest of this, along the first line of defense in the Zaporizhia region, the Russians managed to gain control over Vesele and push all the way to the outskirts of Zatysha, where the fighting is taking place along the defensive line itself, where they are attempting to reach the town from the north, and the capture of Vesele allowed for the Russians to progress towards the fortifications from the east and bypassing Selydove and Vysoke from the north, to likely lead to further offensive operations by the Russians down to the south to outflank the Ukrainian positions, force a withdrawal towards Novapeli, or to encircle their forces and gain control over both settlements, and then advance further along the first line of defense to gain control over Zatysha and have reached the outskirts of the city from the northeast. If we take a closer look at Novapeli, we can see that most of the town is a residential area, regular buildings side by side, along the roads along the southern bank of the Haijur River. As for the northern bank of it, there is some residential areas that are fairly isolated. There's a farm area in the north and the fortifications in the south and in the east. Then there's the river line that goes through the central parts of it as well. So the northern part of it is much more dispersed and isolated from the western parts, which is more dense and consolidated, which means the Russian entry into the eastern part is not unrealistic, even if they lack manpower to do so at such a distance from the supply lines. If they're able to improve their logistics and consolidate their positions to the east and north of it, it is certainly not unrealistic for the Russians to storm it from the north and east, to combine their forces in the northeastern parts, consolidate their positions there, and then dive deeper into the city to gain full control of it. But at the same time, we see developments along the positions here, the forest lines, the forest patches, along the highway, where the Russians looking to gain full control of it and cut off the northern connection to Novapeli, which is again connected to the eastern bank of the Haichi River, which means that it is likely aimed at developing offensive operations towards that as an isolated part of the city. Moving up in the northern direction, the Russians continue offensive operations in the vicinity of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. To the west of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue storming the fortified positions, forest lines, and roads. Here to the west of the city, south of Reshene, storming the fortifications along the E50 highway as well as the railway leading up to the city of Dnipro. The Russians are here widening the areas from which they can attack Reshene from. If they only concentrated their forces through the E50 highway and the 002-525 road, they would be targeted by the Ukrainian drones in the vicinity, all targeting that specific road. But if the Russians are able to gain control over additional roads leading up to Reshene, especially the southern road here along the fortifications and the secondary southern road on the western parts of the town, the Russians are able to gain control over all three roads leading into the town from the south and southeast, and at the same time develop offensive operations in the northern flank towards Reshene from the east. The Russians will be able to attack it from several directions, limiting the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians with their drones. An interesting part is that Deep State Map in the latest update put the northern Dacha in the gray zone, which indicates that the Russians may have 100% full control over the city, because only the small section here in the eastern outskirts, the Dacha area there, and the Dacha area in the north remain under Ukrainian control. Both of these being in the gray zone means that the Russians likely have full control over the city, and the movement is continuing in the direction of Myrnohrad as well, where it is reported that the entire apartment complex area in the northern parts is contested, with Russians expanding through the eastern and southern parts of it, getting control over the areas where the Ukrainians could have direct fire control over the supply lines leading into the city, and developing the offensive operations further within it to establish a proper foothold within it. The Russians now have control over much of the eastern residential area and the central parts of the northern section. While full control over the apartment complex area is not far away, it will allow the Russians to push towards the southern parts to connect the forces in the north and in the south, and in the northern direction as well as additional pushes from the northern flank, all to connect in the central parts of Myrnohrad. If we take a look at the State Map's map, most of the southern part of the city is also in a gray zone. We see these developments over the past 24 hours according to Deep State Map, which significantly increased the gray zone in the vicinity of Myrnohrad, as well as in the northern parts of Pokrovsk. The Russians advanced in the north towards the northern Dacha area, in the east towards the rear of Sukhiyar and Lysivka, both in the gray zone despite confirmation that the Russians have captured these areas, and along the railway leading up to Myrnohrad from the south, which means the Russians likely have an additional supply route into the city as well, and the entire southern parts being in the gray zone except for the apartment complex area in the central parts. This means the Russians will likely soon connect their forces along the highway and railway here in the eastern parts between Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, and push through to the apartment complex area where a geolocated foothold has appeared, and then further up towards the north, where the capture of the apartment complex area will lead to control over the eastern section as well, before moving on to the central parts where they will connect their forces in the east and in the north, and then up towards the exit of Myrnohrad towards Rivne, Svitle, and the other settlements along the area between Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk. This means, with the current rate of advances within Myrnohrad, we are a week or two away from full capture of the city and the consolidation of their forces up towards Rudinsk in the north, Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, for offensive operations going further northwards beyond the cities. The Russian advances to the northern part of Myrnohrad is mainly centered around cutting off the roads leading to the north along the forest lines and forest patches in the area to prevent any further Ukrainian withdrawal, as cutting off the connection to these forest lines will allow the Russians to have control over all portions except for a very small section where the Ukrainians have to push through Svitle and push through open fields rather than the forest lines to get out, which would increase the casualties of Ukrainian forces withdrawing from Myrnohrad. As for the estimates to how many soldiers are within Myrnohrad, it is completely unclear, and I do not have any reasonable information on that. Therefore, I'll leave it as a complete mystery as to how many soldiers are left within the pocket, and at this point I have no viable estimate as to whether it is a lot or few soldiers, because due to the size of the city, even a few soldiers being left within it, a few dozen, 100 soldiers, it could significantly slow down the Russian forces from clearing it, because they do not know where these soldiers are. They have to clear every single building, otherwise they risk getting ambushed, especially if they are resupplied through drones. Therefore, it will take a while for the Russians to clear the city, even if it is empty. Much less if it has 1,000, 2,000 people, then it'll take a while as well, but not much different from it being empty. If it has a lot of soldiers, about 10,000, that is completely unrealistic at this point, because the Russians have pushed through much of it. But at the start of the encirclement, it was a realistic number, before the Russians properly entered into the city, because since then a lot of FAB bombs have been dropped, a lot of artillery strikes and FAB drone strikes, and the Russians have cleared a lot of buildings, which has significantly cut down the Ukrainian presence, not to mention the withdrawals through the corridor has also dwindled the Ukrainian numbers. So at this point it is completely unclear how many remain, but it is only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control over the city. Moving up in the northeastern direction, the Russians have managed to advance to the south of Siversk, gain control of additional fortifications, and flanking Selydove from the northeast. The objective of the Russians here is following the capture of the intersection to push through the railway up towards Selydove from the north, and push them across the river line to the west out of the town. The objective of the Russians here moving through the forest lines and forest patches to the east as well to gain control over the farm area, advance along the railway to the south, and then attack from the eastern flank mostly to push them in the western direction rather than in the northern direction, pushing them over the river line out into the highway and open fields in the direction of Pokrovsk. As for storming Siversk itself, it was reported by a Russian source that the town is still well fortified and it's difficult for the Russians to consolidate their positions on the flanks because they still have to travel quite a distance to reach the town itself, until the Russians captured Selydove and further grind down the Ukrainian defenders within the town with the drawn out battle over the supply lines and striking the Ukrainian supplies heading into the town before the Russians could start storming Siversk itself. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.